Contributions of Aryabhata and Brahmagupta to mathematics and the development of medicine in ancient India made profound and lasting contributions to the global development of medicine, particularly in the fields of mathematics and medicine. Long before the scientific revolution in Europe, Indian scholars developed sophisticated mathematical systems ended in observation and medical systems. Among the most influential mathematicians were Aryabhata and Brahmagupta, whose works laid foundational principles for arithmetic, algebra, and trigonometry. Parallel to these mathematical advancements, Indian physicians such as Jaraka, Sushruta, and Bhagavata systematized medical knowledge under the tradition of Ayurveda, encompassing surgery, pharmacology, internal medicine, and prevention. This essay examines the mathematical contributions of Aryabhata and Brahmagupta and explores the role of ancient Indian scholars in shaping the field of medicine. Aryabhata and the foundations. Aitzik Indian scholars in shaping the field of medicine. Aryabhata earliest and most influential in mathematics and astronomy. His seminal work, the Aryabhata Conversation, is a contact. Despite its brevity, the text demonstrates a high degree of mathematical sophistication. One of Aryabhata's most significant contributions are his systematic use of them. Although the symbol had not yet been formalized, his numerical notation implicitly relied on the concept of zero as a placeholder in the evolutionary step in the evolution. This system later became central to global mathematics through its transmission to the Islamic world and European acute approximation of Vg, calculating it as approximately a value far more precise than those used by earlier civilizations. His work in trigonometry was equally innovative. He introduced the concept of the sine tables at fixed intervals. These trigonometric ideas became essential tools in astronomy and were later absorbed into Islamic and European scientific traditions. In addition, Aryabhata addressed algebraic problems including Seurat equations as well as determinate equations in Indian mathematics. His mathematical reasoning extended to astronomy, where he proposed that the apparent daily motion of the stars was due to the rotation of the earth on its axis, a concept the modern understanding of celestial mechanics. Brahmagupta and the formalization of algebra and zero Brahmagupta pioneered etc. practical algebraic concepts. His major work Brahmasphurti Siddhanta Theta marks the first known text to define zero as a number and to establish arithmetic rules governing its use. Brahmagupta clearly articulated operations involving zeros such as and multiplication, subtraction and multiplication, thereby into a mathematical entity. Although his understanding of division by zero was incomplete, the conceptual leap itself was revolutionary and unparalleled in other ancient mathematical traditions, was using practical metaphors of weights and fortunes. He formulated rules for arithmetic operations involving negative quantities at a time when such numbers negative quantity for negative modern algebra. Brahmagupta also made important contributions to geometry, most notably through his formula for calculating the area of a cyclic quadrilateral. Algebraic methods for solving quadratic equations were general and static, demanded an abstract mathematical approach. The influence of Brahmagupta extended far beyond India. His works were translated into Arabic during the Abbasid period and deeply influenced Islamic mathematicians such as Al-Khwarizmi, Through these translations, Indian mathematical ideas, including zero and algebraic enlightenment, the development of medicine in India alongside advances in mathematics, ancient India developed a highly sophisticated medical system known as Ayurveda, which emphasized holistic health, preventive care, and ethical medical practice. Ayurvedic medical what was supported by systematic classification, detailed observation, and theoretical framework in physiology. Charaka and internal medicine Charaka, traditionally dated to the 1st or 2nd century C, is credited with compiling the Charaka Sa Amaniddatehi, one of the most authoritative lies on internal medicine. His work focused on diagnosis, pathology, and therapeutic principles, emphasizing the balance of Bali humors, doipsayaras, and dental well-being in maintaining health. Charaka's approach to medicine was remarkably modern in its emphasis on preventive health care, physician ethics, and individualized treatment. He recognized the connection between mental and physical health and articulated early concepts of immunity and metazena texts in Ayurvedic education. Sushruta and the science of surgery Sutta, often regarded as the father of surgery, made unparalleled contributions through the Sushruta Sahani traditionally dated to around the extensive descriptions of human anatomy, surgical instruments, and operative procedures. Sushruta documented over text surgicals and more than Bactro instruments, in which his method of rhinoplasty in particular attracted European attention in the 18th century and influenced the development of modern plastic surgery. Vagbhata and systematization in the 18th century synthesized earlier medical traditions in works such as the Agvarta and systematization of medical knowledge into 8 branches: toxicology, pediatric, and geriatrics. His clear and systematic presentation helped standardize Ayurvedic education and practice across the Indian subcontinent. The Indian origins of the Fibonacci assessment, Fibonacci pattern, commonly known as the Fibonacci sequence, is widely attributed to Leonardo of Pisa. Fibonacci, following its appearance in Liber Abaci. However, historical evidence demonstrates that this sequence was known and studied in India more than a millennium. Earlier Indian mathematicians encountered the same Rikha structure while annulling their more than a militaries. This essay examines the early Indian formulations of the Fibonacci sequence, traces its transmission through the Islamic world to medieval Europe, and reassesses Fibonacci's role in the context of global mathematical introduction. The Fibonacci sequence, defined by the recurrence relation f designated f UK variance relation f equimeasure, occupies a central place. BFE EF Safian E-base appearance in number theory, computer science, and natural phenomenology. Nevertheless, this attribution obscures the sequential development in the Indian subcontinent, where it emerged as study of poetic meter and combinatorial. Indian subcontinent were ancient Indian mathematics and was later transmitted to Europe via the Islamic scholarly tradition. Dwaita, the Islamic scholarly tradition, called Dedi. Fibonacci and Liber Abaci. Fibonacci presented the sequence through a problem involving the reproduction of rabbits, which leads to the numerical progression Eken en Tiefan Ento involving Va. Comanche did not claim originality for the sequence, but employed it as a didactic tool to illustrate His primary contribution lay in introducing Hindu-Arabic numerals and algebraic techniques to Europe, thereby shaping the future of Western mathematics, however, the sequent techniques to Europe. Thereby shaping the future of Western mathematics, however, the sequence in manifestations of the Bachi sequence occur in ancient Indian works on Chanda, the study of poetic meter. Indian scholars analyze the number of possible metrical patterns composed of short laghu and long guru syllables. A short syllable was assigned a value of 1 unit while a long syllable counted as 2 units. The problem of determining the number of possible arrangements of these syllables for a fixed metrical length naturally yields Fibonacci. This combinatorial problem did not arise from abstract number theory but from linguistic and aesthetic considerations demonstrating the interdisciplinary direction, contribution to aesthetic, temptation of disinterter appears in the Chanda, a foundation mathematics of Pingala Matheson, where recursive logic underlies the sequence is grabbed. Although numerical examples are absent, the structural principle of summing the two preceding cases is clearly articulated. Later, Virahankar C.C. explicitly stated that the number of metrical patterns of a given length is obtained by adding the counts of the two preceding lengths. This represents one of the earliest clear formulations of the Fibonacci Hemachandra Ekataseshi, who listed the sequence in order while discussing metrical enumeration. In recognition of this concept is sometimes versioned to in Indian scholarship as the Hemachandra sequence, transmission through the Islamic world between the 8th and 12th centuries. Indian mathematical knowledge was transmitted to the Islamic world through trade networks. Tenderly, Indian texts on arithmetic and combinatorics were translated into Arabic, where they influenced scholars in algebra, into Arabic, where they influenced scholars in algebra and number theory. Fibonacci understood as part of a broader process of intellectual transmission rather than independent discovery acquisition, rather than independent discovery. Historiographical consideration. The association of the Fibonacci reflects the dominance of European sources in early modern historiography rather than the true origin of the concept. Sanskrit works remain largely inaccessible and non-mathematical traditions, often marginalized in historical narratives, Recognizing the Indian origins of the Fibonacci sequence contributes to a more accurate and inclusive history of mathematics sequence. Seti conclusion. The Fibonacci sequence innovated from ancient Indian investigations into poetic meter and combinatorial analysis. While Fibonacci played a crucial role in introducing the sequence to Europe and popularizing it within Western mathematics, the underlying concept was developed by Indian scholars such as Vimalchandra. Acknowledging this history underscores the global and cumulative of mathematical knowledge and challenges Eurocentric interpretations of mathematical operations. Conclusion. The contributions of Aryabhata and Brahmagupta to mathematics represent some of the most significant intellectual achievements of the ancient world. Their work on the decimal system, zero algebra trigonometry, formed the mathematical backbone of later scientific developments across cultures. At the same time, Indian physicians such as Charaka, Sushruta and Vagbhata established medicine as a rational, ethical and systematic discipline encompassing surgery, pharmacology, pharmaceutical care together, these achievements that ancient India possessed a deeply rooted scientific tradition that combined theoretical insight with practical application. The transmission of this knowledge to the Islamic world and Europe underscores its global significance and enduring legacy in shaping modern science and medicine. The Zero-Point sequence is tied at his Saturn. The spread of what is now called the Fibonacci sequence into Europe cannot be understood without reference to Leonardo of Pisa. Fibonacci, while the sequence itself originated in India and was transmitted through the Islamic world, its formation in Europe occurred under intellectual conditions fostered by Frederick Visconti's court. Frederick de Puyron was exceptional among medieval jewelers, frauletes and culture. His court in Sicily functioned as a meeting point of Indian Arabic European knowledgeisms, making it one of the most important intellectual centers of the 13th century. A major centennial and background, Leonardo of Pisa was born into a mercantile family. His father served as a customs official in Bugia, modern Sevilla, a major center of Islamic learning. There, Fibonacci studied mathematics under Arabic teachers and became familiar with Hindu Arabic pictures and became familiar with the Avanodic text. It is through this education environment, not directly from India but via Arabic scholarship, that Fibonacci encountered mathematical Liber Abaci and the rabbit problem. Benicio Tupsi published Liber Abaci, a work intended to reform European mathematics and commerce. Among its many examples appears the now famous rabbit reproduction problem, which generates the sequence et t nerukans et etrite trashe. Fibonacci did not name the sequence. He did not claim its discovery. He presented it as a practical problem, not a theoretic construct. This supports the scholarly consensus. The mathematical quote, historical records indicate that Fibonacci came to the attention of Frederick Court scholars in Italy and Sicily. Aron Daisini bite attention of Frederick Tegener's mathematical skill before the emperor's court. One well-documented event is the mathematical challenge posed to Fibonacci by John of Palermo, a scholar. Fibonacci successfully solved advanced problems involving algebraic reasoning and numerical methods which impressed the emperor. As a result, Fibonacci gained in numerical methods. His revised edition of Liber was dedicated to Frederick. His later work, Liber Quadratorum, was also composed in this intellectual climate. This patronage was decisive. Pingent institutional spread across Europe. Frederick Boy's influence extended far beyond Sicily. As Holy Roman Emperor Hesychafro, Sidley networks, Colliery networks in France, and Jamir Nicodisiquas entered Junipity. Over time, later scholars isolated and formalized the sequence, eventually naming it after Fibonacci. In the modern periods, the Islamic bridge, the European adoption, the historical way is therefore well established. Fibonacci learned the material through Arabic scholarship. Tariq provided institutional legitimacy and dissemination. Pines Europe absorbed and later renamed the sequence Frederick D did not invent or mathematically define the Fibonacci sequence, but his role was critical in legitimizing Fibonacci as an authority and enabling the widespread transmission of this knowledge. Conclusion: the association of the Fibonacci sequence with Leonardo of Pisa is historically understandable but incomplete. Fibonacci functioned as a tragically understandable but incomplete. Fibonacci functioned that this incredible number theory illustrates the profoundly interconnected nature of global scientific history. The Great Sindhian: how Indian mathematics reshaped the scientific world in the late 8th century. The center of the world's scientific activity was no longer Rome or Athens, but Baghdad. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, knowledge was pursued with state patronage, translation projects, and systematic study. Among the many texts that entered this interdisciplinary, one work stood out. The word Sindhian was the Arabic rendering of the Sanskrit term Siddhyamta, meaning an established or proven doctrine. It referred not to a single book but to a body of Indian astronomical meaning and matured over centuries in the Indian subcontinent. Arrival of Indian science in Baghdad around Sarsan Tagmali delegation arrived at the court. They brought with them astronomical tables and methods derived from Indian Siddhaivantic traditions, likely based on texts such as the Brit Brahmashud Tinyan Siddhantic tradition. Likely based on texts such as the Bribhamasab Mashak, that these works Bitanzitka Maisen Ale Klevata, that Tehisincho, resulting became the Sindh. This marked one of the earliest large-scale transfers of scientific knowledge from India to the Islamic world. What the Great Sindhian contained, the Great Sindhian was revolutionary, not because it was computational. It introduced by the decimal place value, arithmetic buggy, 0 as a number, not merely a place alone, trigonometric concepts, basically or rather 9 records, methods for calculating it. Planetary, trigonometry, eclipse, length of the year, motions of celestial body. Their models allowed precise computation, which was exactly what Abbasid astronomers required for calendrical reform, navigation and timekeeping. Transformation of Islamic astronomy, they right influence scholars such as Al-Khwarizmi, whose Jai Bech C. Al-Sindhind C. R2G was derived from Indian sources Gila al-Betani, al-Biruni, who explicitly acknowledged Indian mathematical al-Batani, al-Biruni, who explicitly acknowledged Indian methods would later be translated into Latin. From his name comes the word algorithm, and from Indian numerals. From the Islamic world to Europe, between the centuries, Arabic scientific texts began to be translated into Latin in places. Audio Toledo, Sicily, or southern Italy's texts began to be translatable. Indian numerals, misnamed Arabic numeric point, indefinite panti. Why the Great Sindhian was forgotten? The Great Sindhian itself does not survive as a complete text today. Its legacy is preserved through Arabic adaptations, witnessing by later scholars. As a result, the Sindhian's Indian origin was minimized or omitted entirely in European narratives of scientific progress. Historical significance. The Great Sindhi represents, the first global mathematical knowledge transfer. The foundation of Confucius HND, Science, Indian science and modern mathematical thought, which developed far more slowly. It transformed Islamic science, enabled European mathematical revival, and quietly shaped the modern world. Its story is not one of myth or legend, but of calculation, transmission, and transmission, reminding us that science has always been a global enterprise. Below is a non-fiction, historically factual narrative written in a story-like but scholarly manner about Brahmagupta and his work Brahmasapho Titinasiddhanta, often translated as the corrected treatise of Brahma or poetically rendered as the opening of the universe. No fictional events or dialogues are included. Brahmagupta and the opening of the universe. In the year 12 ADC, in the city of Bilam Bidila, modern Bhimel in Rajasthan, a mathematician and astronomer named Brahmagupta completed a work that would redefine humanities under cosmos, space and the cosmos. He titled the Brahmasapho Ki Otitasanta, a Sanskrit term meaning the revised or corrected doctrine of Brahma. In later interpretations, the work came to be described as an opening of the universe because it transformed astronomy from speculative philosophy into a rigorous mathematical science. Brahmagupta was not working in isolation. He was the head of an established astronomical school and part of a long Indian tradition that viewed the universe as something that could be measured, long knowledge while entirely new to the world. A new language for the cosmos, the Brahmasapho, the Paitanta, is divided chapters covering topics ranging from planetary and arithmetic to geometry and what made the work revolutionary was not only its astronomical models but the mathematical tools Brahmagupta used to describe the universe. For the first time in recorded history, 0 was treated as a number in its own right, governed by explicit rules. A number minus itself equals 0 equals 0 equaled his treatment of division. Brahmagupta's formalization of 0 marked a turning point in human thought. It allowed mathematicians to describe absence, balance and symmetry, understanding the universe. Alongside 0, Brahmagupta also gave systematic to understanding the universe. Alongside 0, Brahmagupta also gave systematic views for negative numbers, referring to their mystery alone. It was mathematically universe was not static or naive. He provided methods to calculate planetary longitude. Accurate rules for predicting solar and lunar eclipses, Vinicius vacations for the length of the year. Techniques for solving quadratic equations. One of his most important insights, instead he explained them as the result of shadows and alignments grounded in geometry. This was a decisive move towards scientific astronomy. In geometry, Brahmagupta gave formulas for the area of cyclic quadrilaterals, now known as Brahmagupta's formula, solutions to indeterminate equations that would later infine to India. In the 8th century, during the Abbasid Caliphate, the text was translated into Arabic in Baghdad. It became known as Sindhin, derived from the Sanskrit Siddh Kalamta. Islamic scholars such as Al-Khwarizmi used Brahmagupta's methods in their own works. Through them, Yam-Kohervacher, Indian numerals entered the Islamic world. HB computation developed algebraic computation. Ozies and North Africa. From Aramaic texts, these ideas later entered Europe, forming the mathematical foundation medieval. Why the book matters? The Brodemas Shavtar Efenta was not merely a book of astronomy. It was a new way of thinking about reality by combining arithmetic, algebra, and geometry with celestial observation. Brahmagupta demonstrated that the universe could be understood through numbers. Its legacy includes via the global adoption of Zerovia, the acceptance of negative numbers, Yagya, the mathematization of astronomy, Quaitya, the acceptance of negative discipline. Without this work, later developments in algebra, navigation, physics and space science would have been unthinkable. Conclusion: when Brahmagupta completed the Maspukaita Siddhavanta in Charam, Hongbi Itse, he opened more than a book, he opened the universe to Kalkina Sekta, in the Westmic giving humanity the tools to describe both emptiness and infinity. Though written in Sanskrit on the Indian subcontinent, its influence crossed languages, religions and continents, shaping Khalid ibn Barmak and the passage of Indian science into the Islamic world in the middle of the 8th century as the Abbasid Caliphate rose to power. A quiet transformation began in the intellectual life of the Islamic world. At the center of this Atman Barmak D.P.
Through his patronage of scholars and translators, Khalid played a decisive role in introducing Indian scientific and mathematical knowledge into the Middle East, knowledge that would later shape global science. Khalid ibn Barmak was the first great figure of the Barmakid family, a lineage that would dominate Abbasid administration for several decades. His background itself symbolized cultural transmission.
The Barmakids originated from Balkh in present-day Afghanistan, where they were hereditary administrators, a major Buddhist monastery. Bedi Vardevid in Baj's environment exposed them to Indian religious, philosophical and scientific traditions. Unlike many officials of his time, Khalid viewed governance as inseparable from knowledge. He recognized that astronomy, mathematics and medicine essential for statecraft, necessary for calendrical regulation, navigation, taxation and medicine. During this period, Indian scholars were already renowned for their expertise in Yahweh, astronomy and planetary computation, arithmetic using decimal place, medical theory and pharmacology. Khalid encouraged the Abbasid court to engage directly with these traditions. The translation of Indian scientific texts. One of Khalid ibn Barmak's most significant contributions was his role in scientific works into Arabic. Under his patronage, Indian scholars and texts were brought to Baghdad. Among the most important results of the astronomical trended in Arabic as Sindhind. Around Satluj Sea, Indian astronomical tables likely derived from the Brit Marshall tables, likely derived from the Brahmi Zartigwai taksid mai taiva sittam av Brahma siddha hetne and yatu and jakketerm exep inleikin tavishek Khalid ibn Barmak supported this process administratively and financially, ensuring that Indian mathematics enters the Islamic world through the Sindhian tradition. Indian mathematical ideas spread rapidly. These included via decimal positional note, the operational use of zerogram trigonometric methods based on sine functions, Lyokalia operate, algebraic techniques for solving equine trigonometric methods based on Alkali's patronage created the institutional conditions. All Khwarizmi's works on arithmetic and algebra, which drew heavily on Indian methods, would later be translated into Latin and form the foundation of European mathematics. Thus, Khalid ibn Barmak did not merely sponsor translations, he enabled a structural shift in scientific methodology. Medicine and Indian knowledge. Khalid supported the introduction of Indian medical texts and practitioners whose knowledge of herbal remedies, surgery and diagnostics complemented Greek medical concepts whose knowledge of herbal remedies, surgery and diagnostics complements Sina. The Barmakid legacy Khalid ibn Barmak's sons, especially Yahya ibn Khalid, continued expanded his vision. Under the Barmakids, Baghdad became the intellectual capital of the world, culminating in the later establishment of institutions such as the Beit al-Mikmah, House of Wisdom, while Khalid the later establishes made the groundwork for it. The Abbasid translation movement, often associated with later Caliph, owes its conceptual and administrative Khalid ibn Barmak. Historical significance. Khalid ibn Barmak's importance lies not in authorship but in institutional transmission. He recognized that scientific knowledge was universal and that the Abbasid state could benefit from engaging with intellectual traditions. Through his efforts, Yaptiya astronomy became Islamic astronomy. Indian arithmetic became global arithmetic. Ki extremely cross-cultural arithmetic. Indian arithmetic later developments in algebra, navigation, and astronomy would have been delayed by centuries. Conclusion. Khalid ibn Barmak stands as one of history's great enablers of science. By opening the Abbasid court to Indian scholars and texts, he ensured that centuries of Indian mathematical and astronomical knowledge were seriously extended and ultimately transmitted to Europe. His legacy demonstrates that the progress of science depends not only on great thinkers, Jyoti Dothrefora, reading human life in the language of the sky in ancient India. The sky was not distant or ancient India. The sky was not distant or agriculture. It was intimately connected to human life. One of the six Vedshogas on human life. To subterm show that human actions Vedas, whose purpose was to end, it referred not merely to stargazing, but to a structured science that studied the motions of the sun, moon, planets, and stars and interpreted the Vedic period Jyoti emerged during the late Vedic period, period. Kriyashi, Vedic sacrifices had to be performed. To achieve this precision, early scholars began tracking celestial movements with increasing accuracy. The earliest surviving text, the Vedvoga Jyotimodari, attributed to Lagada Chichomsar Benz, is primarily astronomical rather than predictive. It establishes Li Vai Lar calendars, Ui Tali Kintrikali months, Leomori Naka Kulatras lunar mansions, yet time measurement using celestial cycles. At this stage, Jyoti Pardara focused on cosmic order, datta rather than personal destiny. From timekeeping to human affairs, over centuries, Indian scholars observed that celestial cycles seem to correlate with seasonal changes, biological rhythms, social development of Hora Jyoti Tara, the branch concerned with individual and collective human in a centuries C. Jyoti Tettera had crystallized into three interconnected branches: Siddhar mathematical astronomy, Vya, Hora astrology and human affairs, Tatiyak Satemanhit mundane astrology. Non-astrology natural events, this was not viewed as superstition but as causal correlation. Instead, planets, literally Caesars or influencers, were understood as natural forces whose motions reflected changes in cosmic conditions. Key principles included Vyaya, the moon influencing tides, growth, and mental states. Ya, the sun governing Vaiti seasons, and authority planets marking long-term cycles affecting societies and individuals. This framework aligned with observable phenomena. Lunar cycles affected agriculture's the Nakari system and human life. One of Jyoti Tettera's distinctive contributions is the Nakar Yatra system, those at 8 lunar constellations through which the moon passes. Each Nakar Yatra was associated with Yi koi na, but let's see Gyati Via koi tendency agricultural timing की वो agricultural timing की idea a case central to birth charts BP Hanat Paro Shoptahnivara Herbishak Teshil Nasra and systematization by the early medieval period. Jyoti Purasatta was fully systematized in texts such as the Tirisher Tahori Kallahi Shatat Jakir Hat by Vartahamira, 4th century C. Vartahamira, a respected astronomer, emphasized that Vayog Bidevachitroned in astronomy. Yeha Vayukarha computation without computation Brain Valley, Tade Karshi Manalid, accuracy accuracy was essential. He also rejected fatalism, stating that celestial indicator reveal tendency, not absolute outcomes. Jyoti Tettera and Soheti Jyoti gave their influence. Kingship, coronations, and military campaigns were timed. Fluence, kingship, coronations, and military campaigns were Valgi. Astral and harvesting aligned with lunar and solar phase. Akitarvate transmission beyond India, Jyoti Kotwar Sanlik world between the 8th and 10th centuries through translations of Siddhaimantic texts. Scholars such as Al-Biruni studied Indian astronomy and astrology in depth, recognizing its mathematical rigor. The Arabic intermediary Jyoti Takve Janwai Tepi Hargana concepts influenced Liezali, Islamic astronomy, Vyogyak Dilvera, YAG European astrology, Vivek still operated. Naniyaz, Oinainoilait. By studying the stars and planets, ancient Indian scholars sought to understand timing, change, and rhythm, believing that human affairs unfold in harmony with science. It was not a science of fate, but a science of context, one that framed human life as part of a living, measurable cosmos. Gautama Siddhartha and the transmission of Indian astronomy in Tang, China in the early 8th century. During the height of the Tang dynasty, China stood at the center of a vast Intelezaki India, Central Asia, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Among the scholars who shaped this global exchange was in India's Gautama Siddhartha was not a religious teacher but a scientist, a specialist in Indian mathematical astronomy. Jyotish Mehra presents one of the clearest historical cases of Indian astronomical science being formally incorporated into East Asian state knowledge. Tang China and Imti science knowledge, Tang China and imperial science during the reign of Emperor Xuanzong of accurate celestial knowledge was essential for Year calendar reform, Soculturgical, Eclipspravada, Obria Gacharal, Planchagya, Pitwa legitimacy. Egletopahemon, imperial astronomy was administered by court officials and scholarly ministers. Some sources associate this institutional environment with senior court figures such as Wise Zheng and later administrators of the Bureau of Astronomy. However, no surviving source states that Gautama Siddhartha personally worked under a ruler named Vivizutan. Modern historians theorize their ocean, its Isidon imperial patronage under Imperial Petrozanzong, which is Gautama Siddhartha's role at Kottagon. Siddhartha was appointed as a court astronomer and tasked with contributing foreign astronomical knowledge to Chinese science. He worked during the Kayuan era, a period marked by systematic compilation of technical knowledge. His most important contribution this monumental Zavaiji. Crucially, the Kayuan Zhenjing explicitly preserves Indian astronomical methods, clearly distinguished from Chinese and Persian traditions. Indian astronomy enters China through Gautama. China gained access to Diak of Europe. Indian planetary models Grah theory, Yatya, Kirikit mathematical methods for eclipse prediction. Tigan planetary models, Graha theory, Diaklunekos science, a Indian Siddhakal entity Sami. It relied on numerical calculation rather than symbolic interpretation. The Kayuan Zhenjing carefully records these Indian methods. Often Ideon Zhenjing carefully records the Chinese term for India, scientific not religious. It is important to note that Gautama Chinese scholars valued Indian astronomy because Vitris or sought accurate eclipse prediction. Sheetativya. It used advanced arithmetic methods. Chinese cosmology. This pragmatic attitude allowed Indian science to be absorbed without cultural resistance. Long Pahiyat impact astronomical methods did not did not permanently replace Chinese systems. Their influence persisted in. Liagi astronomical, Yalgi, later Chinese astronomical, compilation, East Asian, Averna Boicho. Historical significance Gautama Siddhgire thus stands as one of the earliest identifiable individuals practiced Indian astronomy outside India as identifiable individuals who Farid Kyoke practiced Indian astronomy outside India. Tezeb Indian mathematical astronomy in a non-Indian language. His careers there ancient science Charaka and the foundations of internal medicine in the early centuries of the Common Era when medicine in many parts of the world was still intertwined with churches intertwined with the road, laid the foundations of interior circuits of physician in the Ayurvedic tradition and beyond for more than millennium. Charaka did not present himself as an innovator detached from tradition. Rather, he positioned his work as a careful revision and exhibition his work as a careful revision. Nagastate students formed the core of an old vision and expansion of earlier teachings, particularly those of the system. The medical world Charaka inherited by Charaka's time, Ayurveda had already developed into a structured medical science with defined branches. Among these, Kate Pidornia Kittison was comprehensive. It dealt with disorders arising from imbalances within the body rather than from trauma or external agents. Charaka approached disease as a natural process governed. He rejected explanations based solely on divine punishment and emphasized observation, reasoning and clinical judgment. Health, in his view, was a state of balance among bodily systems, while disease resulted in the betage an integrated system. These were not mystical substances, but functional principles substances, but burning. Internal medicine, as Charaka defined it, required understanding how these forces interacted with diet and digestion via new environment and climate. Two patients with similar symptoms might require entirely different treatments based on their constitution. Prakotviti diagnosis and clinical method Charaka emphasized a systematic approach to diagnosis, modern clinical reasoning. Physicians were instructed to assess with the patient's symptoms and history, digestive strength, agony, tissue involvement, dysentery. Internal medicine in this framework was a disciplined science rather than a collection of remedies. Therapeutics and preventive care, the Charaka Sedikovyet describes a wide range of therapeutic methods, including Kavit Tako Dahi, Dair Tehekare, Vaguli, Dair, Daibro Laganiddi, Herbal Pharmacology, Arpute, Inculidi, Detoxification Procedure, Kahalirka Karma, Veladi, Dial Guidal Guidance, Lifestyle and Behavioral Guidance. Charaka placed. He argued that maintaining health was a physician's highest responsibility, surpassing even the treatment of disease. Seasonal regimens, daily routines, and ethical conduct were integral parts of internal medicine. Mind and body in medicine, one of Charaka's most enduring contributions to internal medicine was his recognition of illness. He described how emotions Mental well-being was therefore essential to physical health. This holistic view distinguished Charaka's internal medicine from many contemporary systems elsewhere, where mind and body were treated separately. Medical ethics. He outlined the qualities of an ideal physician: compassion, integrity, and humility. Treatment insisted must be guided by the patient. The physician-patient relationship was seen as central to healing, a concept that remains foundational in modern internal medicine. Transmission and global influence. The influence of the Charaka Saramatids ended far beyond India. From the early Medicinic ideas entered the Islamic world through translations and scholarly exchange. For centuries, the Charaka Sahitya Talmud remained a core medical text in India, studied, commented upon, and applied in clinical practice.